Sitting here listening to what we've been talking about for the last hour actually got me really excited because this is a new talk I haven't given before, and a lot of the ideas that are woven through it have already come up on stage. And so really what I want to talk about is a little bit of this idea of how these different emerging hubs or ecosystems, if you want to call them that, or movements around the world in entrepreneurship and in venture capital actually have a lot to learn from each other. And so I live in Silicon Valley, I'm based in San Francisco, but I spend about half my life in about 25 different interesting, emerging, and underserved kind of entrepreneurial markets. And I think they actually have a ton to learn from each other. So quick introduction, if I can make this guy work, let's see. Okay, so this is called the Global VC. Well, Endeavor's not exactly a global VC, but I've spent the last decade of my career working at an organization called Endeavor. Actually, super quick show of hands, who knows Endeavor already? Okay, cool. So I won't spend super long time explaining, but this is where we actually work today. If you look at this map, we work in 23 countries. We have on-the-ground teams in 46 different cities around the world, where all we do is try to find the very best entrepreneurs we can to help them scale. Right? So Endeavor is not at sort of that startup incubation, just getting going level, but at the level of, okay, you've got some traction, you've got some product market fit, maybe you've found a few great local investors or seed funds to back you. How do we help you scale? And the reason we do this is explicitly because we believe finding great entrepreneurs and backing great entrepreneurs in all these markets around the world is exactly how you bring about job creation, wealth creation, and ultimately role model creation for all these different markets. So this is kind of my vantage point, right? We see all these entrepreneurs coming out of all these places, from Latin America, from Turkey and parts of the Middle East, from South Africa, from Southeast Asia, and actually it turns out they have a lot in common. The other piece of this that is fairly new, and those of you who may know Endeavor may not know about this part of what we do today, but I run and manage a $35 million co-investment fund for Endeavor, specifically to support and back entrepreneurs in all these markets when they get to that growth stage. So we actually raised this over the last couple of years, and the thesis is 100% emerging and growth markets. Right? We're not investing in Silicon Valley. We are investing in Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Turkey, Indonesia, Chile, markets that you might not traditionally think about as emerging. We invest in Greece. We invest in Spain. They didn't want to be called submerged, so we're calling them the re-emerging markets of Europe. But these are all ecosystems where I think there are fascinating opportunities and possibilities, not only to find great entrepreneurs, but also to find sort of really important and interesting lessons about how you build these entrepreneurial ecosystems. So this is a little bit Endeavor putting its money where its mouth has been for 17 years and actually investing in some of our companies. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about why I actually think venture capital, or call it entrepreneur support, is both a local game and a global game. So people talk about all the time, oh, VC is a local game, it's definitely a local game. It absolutely is, right? Being physically closer helps, proximity helps, a shared culture really is sort of like a diligence hack of sorts, right? If you're from the same culture as the person you're sitting across the table from, you can understand them much quicker, you can get to know them much faster, you can build that trust that Paul was talking about in terms of really a culture of trust between the two of you. And the obvious direct value add, especially at the early stage, is huge. But I actually think venture, or if it's sort of a shortcut there for saying, supporting companies as they grow, it's also a global game. Because to be very honest, these markets, and Rocket Internet and other guys have figured this out as well, they have a ton in common. The markets do, the consumers do, the challenges are very, very similar, and we see that from Endeavor's vantage point. Also, and I think this is an important one that people don't talk about enough, emerging or sort of incomplete financing ecosystems in these different countries or different cities, they oftentimes need international actors to come and fill in some of the gaps. And so that's not just at the exit or just at the super growth round, but there are these different places where, talk a little bit more about this in a minute, you actually need to raise money in stages to grow a company. And the development of the local financing ecosystems in Istanbul or in Sao Paulo, they're lumpy, right? It's not like you have every single actor perfectly lined up to do exactly, okay, hey, we did the seed and now you guys do the A and then we'll do the B and off to the races. Finally, on the value add part, I actually think pattern recognition globally is very powerful. And serendipity is real, right? So the bigger you sort of expand those networks, the more I think you actually can help some of the companies. This really does become true as companies grow, right? So this is why Endeavor talks a lot about, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life working not really on startups, but on these companies we've come to call scale-ups, right? Starting is easy, scaling is hard. And anybody who's backed good startups and good teams will tell you, scaling is actually particularly hard in these emerging or nascent ecosystems, right? So one of the things I think is super interesting now, if you sit in Miami or if you're part of an angel investing group here or in any of these newer markets, there's actually a ton you can learn from other places, and you don't necessarily have to go to Silicon Valley to learn it, right? So yes, you should look at Silicon Valley and study it. You should look at New York and study it. You should look at Berlin and Israel and some of these other examples. But it turns out you can learn a ton by looking at other markets that are just a couple years ahead of you on some of this growth, right? So e-commerce is awesome until you realize it doesn't really work the same way outside the US that it does in the US. And if you want to learn about that, just go to Brazil or go to Turkey, right? There's some very, very smart people there who've just lived through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of real lessons in this area. Payments are a huge pain in the butt. Start there, work on that. Go see the guys from Alta and the folks in Mexico. Go see the guys in Indonesia who are trying to solve payments for their market of 240 million people. There's some really smart people working on it where, Yellow Pepper is a fantastic example. I bet you they could actually learn from 3 or 4 of the founders who are working within Jakarta, right? So that's an interesting kind of comparison that people aren't always thinking about. Logistics are lousy, right? So start there too. Work on those areas. That's pretty much everywhere. The panel was talking before about the macroeconomic environments of these places. And so macroeconomics definitely do matter, right? See Brazil right now, see Argentina. But role models matter too. And to Christian's point up here, I think some of the examples we've seen come out of Latin America of true role models, like the Mercado Libre story or like the Globant guys who went public last August, these guys are going to be the beginning of being able to tell your mom that you're an entrepreneur, right? That's actually a big part of Endeavor's thesis, is that if we can create those role models around the world, you create that culture of being able to pass the mom test. You also create those mafias that you really need for the next generation. What to do when everyone is playing on the internet or on their phones, right? So you have amazing numbers on Twitter or Facebook of usage, but no one's really paying, yet. That's a really interesting trend you can study because you can go to these other markets and look at it. And being an angel is fun for your first 3 deals or 5 deals or 10 deals, but then what, right? And that really is the same everywhere. So for me, with this global vantage point and kind of looking at what markets can learn from each other or what people can learn from going to other markets, it really comes down, I think, to these 3 things matter the most. And they've all come up already, which I think is great, right? I really think of venture capital as mentor capital, right? If you think of yourself as a mentor first and an investor second, you're going to do really well in this sport, in my opinion. It is absolutely 100% a trust business, right? So Paul's point about building those trust networks, or why they set up in Monterrey and not in DF because the Chilangos had a low trust culture, that's really real, right? Endeavor, nothing against the Chilangos in the audience, right? Endeavor also has an office in Mexico City and one in Monterrey, and in 46 different cities around the world with varying levels of sort of intrinsic or innate trust cultures. And we're trying to raise the bar on the trust culture in all those places, because only when it really gets above a certain threshold can you start to see this kind of impact. The other thing that I want to call out very explicitly, because I think it's under-recognized both in the entrepreneur community and in the investor community, is the idea that if you build a big venture-backed startup, you're going to do it in stages, right? And so for a long time in Latin America, and we still see this in Southeast Asia and some other parts of the world, people thought about raising money as like a lottery ticket or like this thing they were going to do. And then when they raised their first institutional round, they came and say, I raised the money, right? This sort of singular idea of, I raised the money, now I'm done, I'll go build the company forever. And I think the reality, as a lot of people in the room know, it's a lot more complex than that, right? You raise your seed and then you think about, okay, how long does this get me to the next round? And then after that to get to the next round. And it's not just on the entrepreneur side where I think we need to do this education. On the investor side as well, I think in more nascent or emerging markets, there needs to be more coordination, more cooperation, more collaboration around, okay, who's playing in which stages here so we can actually get a company all the way through its whole growth cycle, right? Because those funnels that Christian showed for Europe, if you tried to draw those for Turkey or for South Africa, right, there's actually some pieces where all of a sudden you're just like, well, the number of investors at that stage is 0. So let's see what we do about that. So I actually think this is a really important piece of the puzzle for people to think about. I want to tell just a couple of real life stories to illustrate that last point. So this is obviously the guy on the right smiling a lot is me with slightly more hair, like 3 years ago. But these are 3 of the founders that Endeavor actually backs at a growth stage in Latin America. So the guy on the far right is Daniel from Minha Vida, which is a fantastic entrepreneur in Brazil. The middle is Martin Migoya, the CEO of Globant, which that story's been talked about today, so I won't spend too much time on it. But I want to quickly tell you the story of Raul Polokov, who's the guy standing right next to me, who told me 9 years ago that he was going to become the first founder from Uruguay to raise money in Silicon Valley. And this is a super determined guy building a very non-sexy business, right? Scantech is not a sexy business in terms of what they do, hardware and software for mom and pop grocery stores in Latin America or emerging markets everywhere. But you could just see it in his determination and his grit that he was going to do something really interesting. And what he understood very early on was that for this business to scale, it was going to need not only capital, but great people at every stage of the process. And so we said, okay, great, fantastic, you're going to raise money from Silicon Valley as a Uruguayan company. That's never been done before. Let's see if we can do that. This story starts in like 2005. What we actually ended up doing at that point for the business, which had never raised outside capital before, is we raised a couple $1 million from a small Chilean VC, because there was some money in Chile at that point to kind of get things started. He then went to work and worked really, really hard for almost 5 years before they raised money again, right? So this is not the Silicon Valley story of like, oh, you did your A, and then 9 months later you did your A1 or your B or whatever. Like there was 5 years in the middle of like really hard work by Raul. Fast forward to 2010, 2011, he actually raised a $10 million round. This is all public, so I can talk about it. Raised $10 million from Sequoia Capital. Right? So he actually achieved his dream of being the first company from Uruguay to raise money in Silicon Valley. But that's not the end of the story, right? This company still has a long way to go and a long way to grow. So just this past year, we closed a C round, $25 million for Scantech to really help it go to the next level. Endeavor Catalyst participated. Really great investors in Brazil and great international investors from the IFC who can potentially take this thing to other markets beyond Latin America, right? This could be in India, this could be in Indonesia, this could be a global business. But it needs those stages of financing, and it really needs an entrepreneur who's in it for the long haul, who's really thinking about that if you're going to build a big platform-style business. And I think we've actually got 3 of them on the screen up here. So at any rate, if you do live in Miami and you're interested in the ecosystem here, and you've been to Silicon Valley, and you've been to Berlin, and you've been to London, and you're thinking, hey, where can I actually go learn some lessons that might help the Miami ecosystem and help me figure out my role in it and what to do, well, here's 10 places I think you could go to learn some things if you wanted, right? You can definitely learn something in Sao Paulo. The next speakers up here are going to talk a little more about the Brazilian experience, but I think there's a lot to learn from what's happened in Brazil in the last 6 or 7 years. You can definitely learn some things in Buenos Aires or in Bogota or in DF. I think on a much more sort of specific level, there are interesting lessons to be learned in Medellin or in Monterrey or some of these ecosystems that are a little bit smaller, but they're a little tighter, a little higher trust levels or trust indices, right? And there's some cool things happening. And then if you really want to think about the global perspective, my opinion is the China story is pretty unique. To some degree, the India story is pretty unique. But if you go spend time in Istanbul, Turkey, or in Jakarta, Indonesia, there's some really massive, interesting, and important lessons for Latin America, for Brazil, for Miami. And I actually think the same is true with some of these smaller environments like Cape Town and Amman, right? These are all places where Endeavor's operating and places that I get to go and show up and have the good fortune of meeting just the very best entrepreneurs and the best local investors in these markets. But they're doing real stuff, and I think there's things to learn from them. So where do we go from here? Right, so are you seriously telling me I can learn stuff in Sao Paulo or Istanbul that might be relevant for Miami? The answer is yes. Actually, fun aside, since Eric from Monashees is the next speaker, Eric, together with Anderson Thies from Red Point eVentures, two of the top Brazilian venture capitalists, came with us to Turkey a couple of years ago and actually spoke on a panel at the biggest, like the TechCrunch of Turkey, is this conference called Webrazi. Still today, I was in Istanbul about 6 weeks ago, people come up to me and say, hey, we learned so much from those Brazilian guys because Brazil is so much like Turkey. Can you bring us some more Brazilians back to Turkey, right? So it's not intuitive. You don't think like, oh yeah, obviously Brazil to Turkey, but the markets are so similar and the stage of what they're going through is really, really relevant. So I would just encourage you guys to think about this kind of cross-cultural, I don't know, the title of the talk, 500 Startups, called it a shortcut. I don't know if it's a shortcut, but it is certainly a way to learn a lot in an accelerated way. There really are vibrant clusters of entrepreneurs and investors all over the place, so I encourage you to go see them. And when you go, don't just do the tourism thing, right? Actually meet with entrepreneurs and be a mentor. Meet with some of the local angels and investors and consider like being a co-investor in one of these rounds. Or if you spend a little bit of time in a place and start to really get to know the ecosystem, think about backing one of those emerging managers, because those are the guys, those 3 or 4 or 5 funds that are going to actually be able to invest in those places. I think they're going to make a huge difference in terms of what's happening there. So that is actually the official end. I think I'm 2 minutes under, which, do I get a prize for that or something? But anyway, thank you guys very much, and I'll be here the rest of the day if you have questions.